permission. And Carrie, sorry, I forgot to ask for your permission. You're okay with that?
Yes, I'm ready to go. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And if you are okay, you can share your presentation, a PDF basically version with the audiences, but it's not necessary. I mean, if there's any
Okay.
confidential information, you don't have to do it. Okay.
I will double check on that before I say yes.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the PetroLearn at Home seminar series. Believe it or not, this is the talk number 20. So we have been doing it from mid-April and now we are in mid-June. And we are planning actually to continue the program until end of July with some more interesting talks for you. I'm Hamed Soroush. I'm the CEO of PetroLearn, and I'm really pleased to introduce our expert speaker today, Dr. Carrie Loudon. So as you know, and we have been repeating that, the objective of this seminar series is basically to keep you learning and motivated during this difficult and depressing time. Low oil price and the COVID-19 altogether actually is making our industry a little bit down and not what we really expect to see it and like to see it. But we should try to actually pass through this time and try to stay safe, healthy, and motivated. We have 4 more exciting talks actually scheduled for June, and we are still working on the past talks for July. So we probably will announce the July schedule in a week or so. Please make sure that you follow us on LinkedIn. You check our website for the updates on the past program and also our job openings coming in July and August. Our next seminar for information is going to be on the June 19th. Dr. Sally Greenberg from Midwest Geological Sequestration Consortium is going to actually give the talk titled Carbon Capture and Storage from Biofuels. So it's another talk from the carbon capture and utilization and storage actually space. So our last 2-3 talks on this, basically the carbon storage topics turn to become very attractive to people. So, excuse me, just trying to admit more people in the waiting room. Before introducing Carrie, I would like to ask everyone to mute the microphones and turn off cameras. If you have any questions, just keep it for the end of the session. Either raise your hand or put your question in the chat section. And Carrie will kindly answer as many questions as possible. If you end up actually getting disconnected for any reason during the meeting, as I announced at the beginning, so we record the session, and along with all other previous sessions, you can get access through to the recordings through our website. So, Dr. Carrie Loudon, I had the pleasure to be in a 2 workshop with her back in 2019 October in China. It was, I think, a few days before the initiation of the coronavirus, so we were really lucky. So Carrie holds PhD in geophysics from University of Minnesota and a bachelor degree in geology from the University of Wisconsin. She has been senior geophysical consultant with Geophysical Insights since 2017, working with Paradise, which is a machine learning platform. Prior roles include Vice President of Consulting Services and Microseismic Technology for Global Geophysical Services, and 17 years working with Schlumberger in technical management and sales, starting in Alaska, and including Aberdeen, Houston, Denver, and Reading in England. She spent her first 5 years out of graduate school with ARCO, Alaska, in exploration as a seismic interpreter for the Central North Slope Exploration Team. With that said, Carrie is all yours, and good luck with your presentation.
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Petralearn and Hamid, for putting on this really great series of talks and lunch and learns. And I really appreciate being one of the speakers being included. Oh, here we go, come on. Yeah, it is a little slow. So before I jump into the presentation, and in case anyone gets bored and drops out, I'd like to highlight something our company is doing to help out our colleagues during the current downturn. Geophysical Insights is offering our e-courses for no charge, and that includes our very popular Machine Learning Essentials with certification, taught by our very learned and esteemed CEO, Dr. Tom Smith. We've been running this for almost 2 months now, and you have until July 5th to sign up for any of the courses we're offering. And once you sign up, you'll have plenty of time to complete them. So rush right out and sign up, but hopefully after my presentation. Okay, outline of what we're going to go through today. Why are we interested in machine learning now? We're going to spend a little bit of time addressing terminology for those of you that are new to the topic, and look at types of machine learning, case studies, talk a little bit about the black box connotation that we run into quite a bit with geophysics and machine learning. And that's it. Then we'll wrap up and take questions. So we have both challenges and opportunities for machine learning and geoscience, and actually the challenges in many ways are the opportunities. First of all, geoscience is a physical science. It is grounded in physical laws and principles that have been discovered by our community over multiple centuries of systematic research. Some of the pioneers of geoscience are shown in the pictures on the right. But geoscience features have space and time relationships that are highly multivariate. As you know, the subsurface is heterogeneous. There's fluid, temperature, stress variations, faulting, fractures. Much of this is nonlinear and non-stationary. And it often involves rare but significant events. We're often chasing the outliers. We want to find hydrocarbons, which are not the norm in the subsurface, or you might be looking for permeability in a carbonate reservoir. So we're looking for those rare but significant events. And the data that we have to do this has its own challenges. We have multiple resolutions. If you think of seismic data, you think of gravity and mag at a different scale from seismic. Well data measured, it's highly detailed, but a lot of space between our measurements. We have noise in our data, incompleteness, etc. So these are the challenges that we've been faced with. So what are some of the terms that we use when we talk about machine learning? We have data science, which encompasses anything related to data, cleansing, preparation, and analysis. So data science is the term for the techniques used when trying to gather insights from and information from data. Big data is just massive amounts of data that is difficult to process using traditional database and software techniques. Geophysicists, especially seismic interpreters, have been dealing with big data issues since probably the first multi-fold seismic survey was collected. We've always had a challenge of manipulating and interpreting large volumes of data. And data analytics are simply techniques and processes to reveal trends and metrics from data that would otherwise be lost in the massive information. And our data is growing faster than it ever has, as you can see on the graph above, showing each person in the world is going to be creating 1.7 megabytes of new data per second. So machine learning was defined by Arthur Samuel, a very prominent computer scientist who worked for IBM and he programmed the first computer to play checkers. And he's very famous. And he defined machine learning as a field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. Okay, so what would a presentation be without a Venn diagram? These are categories of data science, and today we're looking at machine learning, which fits into is a subcategory of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence in its most generic form is the quality of intelligence being introduced into machines. So it's a technique in our world that enables computers to mimic human behavior. Machine learning are techniques that give computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. And then we have deep learning, which is a subset of machine learning which makes the computation of multi-layer neural networks feasible. Now, if you were to Google types of machine learning, it would probably return these 4 categories. So let's have a brief look at what they do. Supervised learning, I'm told, is the most popular method currently in our industry. So supervised learning takes known input data and trains a model to apply apply to new data and predict a result. An example might be something like a porosity model from pre-stack seismic inversion that's been trained on well data. An advantage of supervised learning is that you do get a very specific answer directly from your model. Unsupervised learning is quite different and has its own advantages. Unsupervised learning has no a priori knowledge of the data it is organizing, and the training it does adapts itself directly from the data. It's been compared, or is known to be directly compared to the way infants learn in their first year of life. An advantage of unsupervised learning is that it can find patterns in data that might not exist in the training data we use for supervised learning. And certainly the experience of our company has found this to hold. Semi-supervised learning simply combines supervised and unsupervised learning to achieve goals. Before the talk, I was thinking through some of my previous colleagues and work with multi-attribute data, and we had a really good petrophysicist in our last company who would build us new density and sonic logs by going in and training neural networks to replace bad data. So even he didn't have any qualms about throwing out measurements if he could predict a good sonic log from other logs that had quality where the sonic and density didn't. So that would be a good example of semi-supervised learning. And then reinforcement learning is an algorithm which learns over time to maximize returns based on rewards it receives for performing certain actions. The case studies today are mostly going to focus on these first 2 categories, supervised and unsupervised learning. Although I do have one semi-supervised learning example to slide in. So our types of machine learning, on the left, we see the supervised learning, which is a task-driven method, and it's predicting a value from a set of inputs. The methods shown in red are all non-neural network methods. And then unsupervised learning is data-driven, and that's looking for patterns in the data. And both supervised and unsupervised learning can use neural networks. And in addition, on the unsupervised side, we also include dimensionality reduction methods such as principal component analysis. So moving on into neural networks. The brain is a collection of 10 billion interconnected neurons, and each cell uses biochemical reactions to receive, transmit, and process information. So our biological neural network provides the model and the terminology that we use in computer science, in our artificial neural networks. So an artificial neural network is a simulation of a biological neural network and comprises a large number of highly interconnected processing elements called neurons. In the supervised learning example, the input data is consumed by the neurons in the first layer, which are not hidden, and those neurons then provide an output to the neurons within the next layer, and so on, until it reaches a final output. That output might be a prediction, like a yes or no, fault or no fault, dog or cat, etc. Each layer can have one or many neurons. By contrast, unsupervised learning is a type of machine learning that looks for previously undetected patterns in a data set with no pre-existing labels. So instead of responding to feedback, cluster analysis identifies commonalities in the data and reacts based on the presence or absence of such commonalities in each new piece of data. So to make sure you're paying attention and staying awake, see if you can predict the value in the last cell in our chart here. If you guessed 81, congratulations, you've just successfully accomplished supervised learning. Okay, so within supervised learning, we're going to talk about deep learning, which is really the most popular approach today in application to seismic interpretation. And in deep learning, the CNN, convolutional neural network, is a class of deep neural networks that's applied to analyzing visual imagery. And those CNNs were invented in the 1980s. The main breakthrough in applying them has been in the 2000s with the availability of GPUs. And a convolutional neural network is simply a neural network that uses convolution in place of general matrix multiplication in at least one layer. So some of the pros and cons of supervised neural networks. The pros are you have a very clear objective in mind when you train it. It's very easy through cross-validation to measure the accuracy of your results, and the training is controlled. The cons are it's very labor-intensive to generate the labels for your neural network, for your training images, and sometimes you have limited data to work with, and it yields limited insight. However, it's an excellent technique for automating mundane tasks for interpreters. So I'd like to show a couple examples of this. So here's a couple case studies I'm going to show from deep learning CNNs. And in the first one, we've overcome one of the issues, which is having an interpreter have to do the job of training the neural network. So this is a CNN-based fault detection on a North Sea 3D seismic data set. And one of the promising developments for fault detection is an efficiency that's been gained by using a synthetic fault engine. So in the example on the left, we've co-rendered amplitude with seismic coherence, which is one of our traditional, very popular ways to extract fault locations from amplitude data. And you can see in this example, the coherence in the upper part of this section is really highly contaminated by noise or syneresis. And even in the lower section where the faults are quite clear, hopefully people can see my arrow. It did an okay job, but when you look at the time slice, the resolution of the cross-cutting faults is not that great. So on the right-hand side, we have the CNN-based fault probability volume co-rendered with the same amplitude volume. Now, no human pick data was required to generate this result, to generate this volume. And you can see it's done a much better job than the coherence. And even in the shallow section, we're getting some decent fault picks. But what's really impressive is when you look at the time slice and how clearly these faults can be visualized in both fault directions. So both azimuths are clearly imaged. A second case study is going to be about deep convolutional neural networks for seismic facies. So when we look at this image, the human eye can pretty easily pick out what we would call packages of seismic facies that we might want to interpret. And the facies are really just reflection patterns at different scales. These are easy for us to see, but actually quite difficult for a computer to recognize. So you can see we have some volcanics. We actually have a gas chimney coming up. We've got multiples. We've got stacked channels. We've got kind of low angle layered sediments, and down deep, we've got tilted fault blocks. So we have to go in as an interpreter and actually pick and label some of these facies that we want to be interpreted in the volume. And so you can see on the left, here are the user-defined facies we use for training. And to the right, then you can see we get a prediction of a facies on another seismic line in the volume. And eventually, you do produce a full 3D interpretation. And there's certainly plenty of applications available that are offering these kind of technologies to interpreters. So really what we get out of the deep seismic facies classification is a classification result that provides well-defined, clean 3D geobodies that are actually produced in a much quicker fashion, even though it takes a while to build the training engine. It would take an interpreter a lot longer to go through and pick all these by hand. And then you can take these outputs and actually go in and perhaps do a multi-attribute analysis on one of the facies or some of the facies that you're interested in. Okay, so now we're going to have another exercise in machine learning example. Well, I guess this isn't machine learning, this is brain learning. So this is moving into unsupervised learning. If you look at these images, how many patterns or clusters can you identify? So you could classify them by shape, round or boxy. You could classify them by fruit or non-fruit. You could classify them by color, red, orange, and blue. So hope everybody is paying attention, and congratulations. You've now accomplished unsupervised learning, so you can now claim some continuing education credits for having done supervised and unsupervised learning. So what is unsupervised learning? It's a type of machine learning that looks for previously undetected patterns in a data set with no pre-existing labels. So instead of responding to feedback, the cluster analysis identifies commonalities in the data and classifies them according to the commonalities that it finds. So some of the pros and cons. The pros of unsupervised learning are it can be very fast. You get results quickly, and it can provide disruptive insights that you won't get out of supervised classification necessarily. The cons are it's difficult to measure the accuracy. We find tying to wells is very important, and it's actually critical to understanding what your unsupervised neural network has produced. Therefore, it does require some experience to get confident with comfortable with the results of unsupervised. And then it also suffers from the curse of dimensionality, which we'll cover in the next slide. So the curse of dimensionality, if you look at this diagram, refers to the phenomena that occurs when we analyze several different dimensions of data at once. And as we go into attribute space, so beyond 3D, for every attribute we're introducing, we're adding another dimension in attribute space. And as the dimensionality increases, as we map this volume into 3D, you can see that the volume of space increases so fast that the data is sparse. And so we're not providing data in every cell to be able to analyze. So as the number of data types or dimensions grow, the amount required of data that you're required to analyze it grows exponentially. So when we're using unsupervised learning, you really need to find some ways to reduce the dimensionality. And one of these is incorporating prior knowledge. So if you're doing, say, an AVO study, you probably have a good idea of which attributes you're going to use. A lot of experienced interpreters go straight to their attribute list without even running the PCA. Or you can reduce your dimensionality by employing dimensionality reduction techniques. Some of the benefits are listed here. So dimensionality reduction brings the dimensions you're looking at down to the part of the data space where your data is dense and ignores the parts where the data is sparse. And the most popular way to do this is through principal component analysis. And some of the projects I used to work, we would have hundreds of attributes. And I'm sure anybody that's worked with multivariate seismic attributes has faced that challenge of having dozens, if not hundreds, of different attributes that you can generate from your data, and trying to understand which ones are the ones that are important and what to use in your multi-attribute analysis is a challenge. So PCA gives us a tool to address the dimensionality issues. And PCA is a linear technique that reduces a large set of variables to a smaller set that will still contain most of the variation of independent information in the large set. So in other words, PCA will help us find the most prominent, important subset of attributes. A quick run through what the terminology is around PCA, and anybody that's ever been to any of our presentation has probably seen this slide. So some of you might have seen it 20 or 30 times. But let's take a 2 attribute case where we just make a scatter plot of attribute A and attribute B. And we're looking for the largest variation in these two, this scatter plot. And that would occur along this red line. So the red line is giving us our first principal component, which is the largest variation. And what's the second largest variation in the data? It's along that green line. So that's the biggest spread in the 90 orthogonal to the first principal component. So that's our second principal component. A few other terms to learn are the eigenvector, which is the direction of the line, which shows the variance or spread in the data. And the eigenvalue is the value showing how much variance there is in the eigenvector. So PCA has the ability to separate attribute types for us by frequency, distribution, and character. So this example, we're showing a practical PCA on 12 instantaneous seismic attributes. And this chart is showing us the highest eigenvalues for eigenvector 1 on each inline. So you can go in and query each of these inlines and it will show you the contribution of various attributes to the eigenvalue. So looking at eigenvector 1 and looking at the attributes which are contributing, I know it's really hard to read the table, but within the first principal component, there's 4 attributes that are each contributing more than 20% to the eigenvalue. And then it drops off very quickly to below 10% for the other 8 attributes. Moving on to the second eigenvalue, we have 3 attributes contributing to that eigenvalue, and then it drops off quickly again. So if we were to just take the first two principal components into our neural network, we will have already reduced our number of attributes from 12 to 7. So you go through this analysis and you visualize your attributes to make sure you're not introducing coherent noise, or there are attributes that will definitely show you noise in your data as well. And you bring those into the neural network, and the neural network we're going to look at is a self-organizing map. So SOM is a method that uses attribute space to classify seismic samples. So the first thing we do with SOM is we start in our survey, our 3D survey, and you carve out a zone of interest, because if you run this over the whole volume, the geologic conditions are changing with depth or with time. So it's the attributes that are responding at different depths may change significantly. So you focus in on a zone of interest, and you'll generate, you'll generate your attributes over that zone of interest and run your PCA. And from PCA, perhaps we'll get 10 attributes that are showing prominence in the data. So that's what we take into our SOM. So 10 attributes in attribute space gives you 10 dimensions. So our data from all our attributes are normalized and taken into attribute space. And then our seismic samples eventually are organized into natural clusters in attribute space. So we introduce neurons into empty multi-attribute samples, and then these neurons will seek out the natural clusters of like characteristics in the seismic data. So the neurons learn the characteristics of a data cluster through an iterative process of cooperative and competitive training. And once the learning is completed, each cluster is assigned to a neuron number, and each seismic sample is now classified. So the topology of a SOM is one of the things the interpreter actually has to decide. And so you can classify several different topologies. Typically, you'll do something, you might do a 3x3 if you're just doing mapping a large area and you want to break out the big features. And if you're doing detailed stratigraphic work, you might do an 8x8 as we're showing in this example. So once you've assigned all of your samples to a neuron, those are mapped back into survey space, and you have a 3D volume of classified seismic samples that you can then interrogate. So our first case study, we're going to do 2 case studies for SOMs. This is from the Niobrara Formation in the DJ Basin, and I'll take you through the full analysis. The DJ Basin is an asymmetrical foreland basin covering 70,000 square miles over 4 states. It has 47, probably 50,000 now oil and gas wells, and a production history that dates back to 1881. The Wattenberg field is shown here, and it's as a conventional field, it's a basin-centered gas field, and it's operated by Noble and what was formerly Anadarko. Starting in around 2009, the operators turned to unconventional oil, and they started drilling horizontally to extract oil from the Niobrara Formation, which is shown here in a cartoon setting. And their primary targets were 3 chalk benches. They're about 15 to 30 feet thick. They're informally named A, B, and C. And when they started drilling horizontal wells, they quickly encountered a lot of faults because they didn't have seismic data. So quickly, they commissioned 3D seismic over the field, and that's really improved their ability to drill and complete wells. Another target that has also become very popular is the older Codell sandstone. It sits unconformably beneath the Niobrara, beneath the Fort Hayes limestone. And the Codell is quite heterogeneous. It's also late Cretaceous in age, and it thins from north to south because it's erosionally truncated. And so these 4 targets are the general targets these days for drilling and production. I should also mention in around 2010, the conventional wisdom was that the Wattenberg field was the only place the Niobrara had good production, but then EOG drilled a well north of the field and opened the play considerably by getting good production out of what was called the Jake well. So now there's a lot of drilling and, or there was, I should say was, prior to 2020, a lot more exploration and production happening outside of the main Wattenberg field. But our study is going to focus up here in the north. So GPI and geokinetics, now Fairfield, undertook a multi-client program that ran for about 4 years, and they provided us with 100 square miles shown here in the western part of their multi-client survey. We had about 30 wells from the Colorado database that you can see here. The ones highlighted in red had a full petrophysical analysis run on them to help us tie in our results. Here's our 2-way time structure for the top of the Niobrara. It's coming up to the Rocky Mountains in the west, so it's kind of a monoclinal structure, probably anticlinal. If you keep going far enough, it'll come back down. This inset to the left is just showing the fracture types that we can expect and the structural elements that form them. And all of these structural features are present in the Niobrara. The inset is from the Austin Chalk. The most positive curvature attribute on the top Niobrara shows you the 2 main structural fabrics that you can see in the reservoir. A northeast to southwest trending pattern and a northwest to southeast pattern. And you can see that you would expect quite a bit of compartmentalization of the reservoir based on the curvature. The data shown here is the original amplitude data. The quality was quite good. And an important thing to note, so the top of the Niobrara is very easy to pick. It's a strong peak followed by a pretty wide trough. Our B chalk is approximately where this second peak occurs. And there's a lot of bed-bounded faults within the Niobrara section. So you see a lot of faulting that doesn't come through the top. And this can make it a challenge to try to predict the depth of your chalks because you don't see the same features at the seismic horizon that's easy to map. So keep in mind, this is about 60 milliseconds of data. And within it, we have 3 reservoirs that we're trying to delineate. So our PCA results that we input to SOM, in the first eigenvector, we found sweetness was the #1 attribute. And in the second, thin bed indicator. And it's always good to go in and preview your attributes to make sure that you're not bringing artifacts into the SOM. So we ran the PCA. This is near the B chalk, so it's sliced down from the top of the Niobrara. And we ended up with 8 instantaneous attributes. So the results show a really nice classification of the amplitude data. So above we have our original amplitude data, and below you see the SOM results of an 8x8 SOM. And our B bench is right in the middle here. It's very easy to see, and you can track it throughout the data set. And if we zoom into the well, you can see a really good correlation between the red neuron, which is sitting in the middle of the B, and the maximum carbonate content, which you can see over here in our lithology log. And the B chalk can be found throughout the survey by the stacked pattern of red, yellow, red neurons. with the red representing this maximum, kind of the sweet spot within the chalk bench. So again, each neuron here is 1 millisecond in seismic time. So the B chalk is resolved to a 5 to 6 millisecond seismic interval. And we're going through this pretty fast, but I'm just trying to give you kind of a taste of what a SOM result does and looks like. So you can also look at the deeper codel, which is a little bit trickier to find. So, and we ran a second SOM using the same attributes and edited the color map a bit to make that codel kind of pop out. And one of the interesting things you see is over on the north side of this inline, you see a very continuous 2 neuron stacking pattern in the codel SOMs, whereas you go further to the south, you can track it through here in the yellow and red. And I wanted to look in 3D to see how far this red-yellow pattern extended and whether we could assign some geology to it. So a couple of things of interest. You can turn on just the neurons that you're interested in seeing, and you can find these red areas all have this neuron 6 present. And then you have the areas that are more the orange and yellow neurons. And then you see an area where none of the 6 neurons that I'd previously identified are present in the codel. So we'll look at 2 things related to that. A cross line going through that section where you didn't see the same classification neurons actually shows that the Niobrara section, Niobrara codel section in the seismic is quite disrupted. But with your Niobrara top up here, it's much less evident in the Niobrara how broken up it is compared to the deeper codel section. And I also noticed you actually have a bit of a pull down here, so that could be a hydrocarbon indicator. So I postulated that this area of the geology in this area might indicate a higher amount of fractures, and that those fractures might actually indicate a gas charge. And when we look at the neuron classification, you see again to the west, you have the nice yellow and red combination. And then we go into the yellow-orange combination, and then we completely have a different set of neurons through this part of the seismic data. And you can go in and look at individual neurons and see what attributes are contributing to that neuron classification. So we did that, and it's hard. Sorry, I guess I should have made this a little bigger. But the top attribute in neuron 6 is instantaneous frequency, followed by Hilbert and thin bed. And in neuron 61 in the disrupted area, the top attribute was instantaneous Q, followed by instantaneous frequency. So your attributes are definitely telling you something is changing and something is different. And going back to the well control, what we found in the one well we had the petrophysics run in the west is that we had a V shale in that area where you see the really coherent pattern that you can follow. That's got a V shale of about 40%. And these 2 wells to the east have a lower V shale of around 17%. And the well that's furthest to the east actually had the highest effective porosity between these 2 wells. So the seismic classification can really be used to perhaps show you where not to try to drill in the codel. Over here to the west, where it's very shaly, might not even be an attractive place to try to drill. And over here, you do have a much more attractive reservoir. Okay, our second case study comes from some colleagues of mine at Geophysical Insights and Lewis Energy. So these aren't my slides, but I'll do my best to make them make sense of them. So this is unsupervised learning for a conventional reservoir. Our setting is onshore Colombia, and here's the tectonic setting. It's the northwest margin of the South American plate, overriding the Caribbean plate. And the field occurs within the San Jacinto Fold Belt, which is a West Virgin fold and thrust belt. And the target strata are Eocene, and there is Upper Cretaceous strata, but our reservoir is in the Eocene. And the total survey shown here is about 300 square kilometers. Here's a dip line through one of the wells on the 3D survey. So you can see the wells have targeted this structural high, paleo high, and the reservoir formations are located between this yellow seismic horizon and green. So to date, 8 wells have been drilled within the 3D survey and 7 have found pay. 1 well had reservoir that was thin and mostly water saturated. So they took the approach of trying neural network SOM classification to improve their understanding of the distribution of the reservoir facies and de-risk their future drilling. So the initial interpretation was done manually on a coarse grid throughout the 3D survey, and this was gridded to produce smooth horizons. But the team updated the interpretation by using a low topology SOM along with the original interpretation and the well control. So the full stack volume was used to produce this SOM to revise the interpretation, and only 3 attributes were used: the normalized amplitude, the instantaneous frequency, and the instantaneous phase. So you can see that the purple neuron helped to guide the interpretation, especially the upper horizon. So this the data was available in near, mid, and far stacks, and this is a gas field. So they decided to do the detailed stratigraphic work on the far stack volumes. And here you see an arbitrary line through a 5x5 SOM that was generated using the far stack and 5 instantaneous attributes. From the PCA, the most prominent attributes were normalized amplitude, instantaneous phase, envelope, Hilbert transform, and sweetness. Now notice how compartmentalized the reservoir is. Wells 4, 5, and 6 appear to be in a continuous reservoir, but then we have different neurons between these wells, separating them from wells 2 and 3. So well 3 actually has 2 pay intervals, and then well 2 appears to be isolated from all of the other wells. Well 7 that you can see down here is the one that had 5 feet of pay and water, but you can actually see the SOM is showing there may be quite a bit of updip potential. And then well 8 had a different neuron topology completely. So looking at the extent of the 3 main neurons, 2, 3, and 12 in the reservoir, you can actually get a 3D image of this reservoir, and you can see it's quite compartmentalized. And your main structure is running this way. If you add all of the neurons associated with pay in these wells, you can then get some additional upside potential in drilling targets. And then notice that well 8, again, has a completely different neuron topology. And it turns out that well 8 was a bit surprising. It didn't find gas, it found oil. So the seismic was actually responding to this, and you can map out the extent of the reservoir for neuron 8 and get your reserve calculations if you know some of the other reservoir parameters like net to gross, porosity, and water saturation. Plus you have to have a velocity, of course. Okay, so that gets us through most of the case study information, and I know we're running close to the end, so I'll try and talk fast. All right, we've already seen this slide. I'm going to give you a quick look at a semi-supervised learning. So this is where we just combine the 2 methods. And in this case, we can use the 2 techniques we've just seen, which is using a self-organizing map to produce a classified 3D volume from multiple instantaneous attributes. And you can actually take these SOM results and put them through a CNN fault detection algorithm to perhaps get a better fault detection result than we do if we just use an amplitude volume. So some other considerations on machine learning. The math has been out there in the literature for 40 or 50 years. It's straightforward. However, there are thousands to millions of computations, and this does make people think that machine learning is a black box. So an experienced interpreter, we all know that for seismic data, we have incoherent and coherent noise. You may not have enough labels. You may not have enough data. So if you do a poor job, like any process, you can get garbage in and garbage out. But really, what does machine learning do to change geoscience interpretation? Everything in this list is currently being done and can be done today using a machine learning approach. About a month ago, I attended a webinar by TGS where they have come up with an AI method for reconstructing velocity logs in areas that they don't have those logs, but they do have well control. And they showed how they applied these new logs to their PSDM processing and how much of an improvement they got in their depth errors. So again, all of these technologies are available today. And it certainly, I think, provides a way to give us a higher quality result faster. So that in itself could be profound and is necessary. So really, what is the future of machine learning in geoscience? And I think I've been asked this in China as well. Is machine learning going to replace interpreters or replace geologists? So it is a disruptive technology, and it will not replace geoscience interpreters. However, geoscience interpreters who do not use machine learning will probably eventually be replaced by those who do. So in conclusion, I'd just like to acknowledge the contributors to this presentation, Camilo Sierra and Deb Sakry, and Lewis Energy for our Columbia example, GPI and Fairfield for providing the Niobrara data set, and my colleagues at Geophysical Insights for most of the material I showed today. And with that, thank you very much for those of you who lasted through it, and I'm happy to take questions.
Carrie, it was a nice presentation. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we got some questions here that I will read through. Yeah, somebody is asking about the case study 2. Amplitude and sweetness seems to be redundant attributes. Do you filter out redundancy in the attributes?
Oh, that's a good question because I've worked on projects where we very carefully screen and use independent attributes. But really what we find is using like attributes is the attribute space equivalent of stacking. So we actually like to use redundant attributes because those attributes will cluster and will show up together in the same neuron. It's counterintuitive, but that's actually our approach.
Okay, I have a general question about the genetic algorithms. Are these similar to unsupervised, or are they a different breed of algorithms? Okay. Sorry.
Ooh, I don't know if I can answer that one, but I'd be happy to take genetic inversion, I believe, is supervised because you're actually inverting for rock properties. But I'd be happy to follow up. You can see my email address down there. So I do want to make clear I'm a user of these techniques, and I'm primarily an interpreter with a geophysics degree. But we definitely have experts out there that can answer the details on the algorithms.
Thank you, Kerry. I can say that is a totally different concept behind it, but I cannot explain more because I'm not expert in this. So I see Masood actually is raising his hand and wants to ask a question. I'm going to unmute you, Masood, and you go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, everyone. Many thanks for this great presentation. I have a question about the reservoir monitoring and supervised and unsupervised machine learning. In fact, during the last 2 months, I asked this question in several webinars and talks, but I didn't find any clear response. But today, I believe that I finally found the right person to clarify this issue on my mind. About reservoir monitoring, I really like your presentation when you start with the seismic data and you introduce it as a big data. The challenges that we have in seismic data, lots of hidden information with different levels of uncertainty. So when we are talking about the machine learning on seismic data, especially for the integration of the seismic data into the reservoir monitoring, interdisciplinary nature, integration of seismic with the engineering and reservoir simulation data, and this kind of studies, is it wise to move to unsupervised machine learning? Because as I understood, the quality of machine learning is dependent on the training data set. And when we move to the unsupervised machine learning, we may introduce or we may create lots of incorrect information. So I really would like to know your idea about the supervised and unsupervised in the seismic data integration about the reservoir monitoring. And my second question is about the 4D seismic data. And have you ever tried that PCA studies on the 4D seismic attributes? And can we consider for example, the signal to noise ratio for the baseline and monitor seismic data as a first quality control to choose the best set of the 4D seismic attributes for the future foreseeable future of the field? Many thanks.
Oh, wow. Okay. So I'll take the second question first. We do have 4D case studies, and we have a student at the University of Houston right now that's completing a PhD that has used unsupervised learning on 4D seismic from New Zealand. And I haven't seen the work, but my understanding is she's done some very clever ways to actually run the unsupervised learning simultaneously on baseline and time-lapse data. And I'm actually really looking forward to seeing that. The classification actually, I think, is able to overcome at times high signal to noise, or low signal to noise, but I think I have to qualify that by saying it needs to be incoherent noise. Coherent noise, even in machine learning, is a very difficult problem to overcome. We can classify it, and I think we're going to move toward using classification to help eliminate it by feeding it back to processing. And then on the question of reservoir monitoring, I've seen a lot of case studies where they're touting, a really great, they show some great ties to wells, but you can often look at the same tie and look at another part and they've actually completely missed it. What I do think that unsupervised classification brings data-driven, purely data-driven approach, and sometimes you can get a higher resolution. But the supervised learning certainly has its place, and it certainly works in a lot of settings, especially I'd say rock properties where you're trying to get directly to geomechanical properties, or in AVO studies we've had tons of success. But we can actually use the two techniques together quite they're quite complementary, and there's no reason not to try both. The only reason being time and money, of course. In a perfect world, we can try both. So I hope that addressed it, answered the question.
Thank you, Carrie. I see actually several questions from Alan, so I would like to ask Alan to unmute and ask the questions. But okay. Before that, Alan, I want to ask a question from Gerald, written there. Do you use the PCA results or original features for training the SOM model?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. The PCA is available to the SOM, and the SOM process can take the relative weights of the attributes from the PCA and apply those when it's generating the SOM.
Perfect. Alan, would you mind asking your question directly from Carrie rather than me reading your many questions? You ready, Carrie?
Yes. I don't see the questions, but that's good. So keep reading them.
Alan, are you there? Okay, let me try to unmute him. I don't see Alan actually anymore. Yeah, he's probably kicked out. Let me read a few of his questions. How do you assess uncertainty in the predictions?
Oh, that's such a good question.
Okay,
I didn't show it. In addition to, so in the SOM example, in addition to your classification of your sample, it also outputs a probability. So you can actually screen the results based on the probability. Because obviously there are definitely samples that don't fit in easily or well to any single neuron. And we do have a case study that's Rocky Rodins that shows how an AVO example where by just looking for the low probability neurons, he was able to map out an accumulation. So yes, that was an oversight that I didn't talk about probability. And the same in the deep learning, probability is a product that is output along with the classification volume.
Okay, and I'm going to actually combine two more questions and then we call it the last question. So, do you recommend basically machine learning for any quality seismic data acquisition, processing, or imaging, or basically there are criterion that? And then the second question is that there are many attributes that are actually correlated with each other. Basically, can you talk about that as well? Do you eliminate them or you include all of them? I think it's a question about the bilinearity. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a similar question.
Cool. Yeah. Okay.
And I also wanted to mention, going back to the PCA results too, there are a lot of attributes that don't follow a normal distribution. So using PCA sometimes to select attributes isn't always necessary, and that's where sometimes your knowledge can actually benefit you. So you could build a SOM, you could classify geometric attributes, for example, and a PCA may not necessarily give you information on a curvature or a coherence volume or a fault probability volume, but you could still run that through a classification. And in that case, you just have to kind of go with your understanding and visualize the attributes that you think might be helpful in discriminating what you're looking for. The quality issue is, that's still a tricky one. I've seen some projects where, and a lot of it is, I would say, can you see your reservoir in a seismic event that's in your data? If you can see it in the amplitude volume, even if it's noisy, you're going to have a lot better chance of success. I worked on a project where the well ties, you would have to draw a line through a big old seismic reflection to tie two wells together. And that's not going to be very easy to get a valid result from. And then back to the question of attribute correlations, we do work with correlated attributes in the SOM process. But, certainly we're looking to build more tools, I'd say, that look at the correlations between wells and seismic attributes. That's always a really good first pass, is to just try and understand if you have a direct correlation between some seismic attributes or, a somewhat weak correlation, you definitely want to keep that attribute in the data set that you're analyzing. So I hope that helped answer some of those.
Sure, definitely. I'm getting some good feedback about your presentation, people thanking it. But yeah, it was an excellent presentation. Thank you very much, Carrie.
Well, thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. We hope that we have more presentation from you in future. With that said, I want to thank everybody who attended the meeting. See something that is left. But our next talk on Friday is just follow us on LinkedIn for more updates about our HAS program. With that said, I want to close the session and wish you a lovely week and enjoy your days. Thank you.
Thanks again, and people can contact me on LinkedIn too if they'd like to know more or have more follow-up or more details on anything I showed today.
Yes,
so
please
thanks
search
again.
Carrie Loudon on LinkedIn.
And yeah, I'll see you on the next one, and I'll enjoy being a spectator next time.
I appreciate
Take care.
that. Yeah, have a good one. Bye-bye.
You too. Bye.